live long and prosper. So in this video series, I'm going to be talking through the social justice elements of every episode of the original series of Star Trek. The thing that inspired this project was actually a Fox News article which argued that Star Trek has in some way betrayed its traditional commitment to sort of political neutrality or middle ground by embracing progressive politics. In this series, we're going to see that Star Trek has always embraced progressive politics, and it's always been aspirational for social justice in various senses. I am taking a broad perspective on social justice here, so that may include multiple different types of social justice, whether that's racial, whether that's economic, whether that's religious, whether that's abilities, gender and sexuality, anything broadly considered. I will go through every episode. Some of the episodes I will interview fellow Trekkies and talk with them about it. And then below, in the descriptions, I will give you additional information about the episodes, particularly their original air date, who wrote the screenplay, and who directed that episode. I also want to dedicate this series to my dad, Michael Allen Zapkin. He was an OG Trekkie from back in the day, and it was watching the original series with him that I came to love Star Trek.
So in this video, we're going to be talking about The Way to Eden, the space hippies. I'm joined once again by my friend Matt Paige. Matt, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me again.
Yep. Third time. So Matt, do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Well, I don't really know what else there is to say. I don't really, I'm just, classic armchair historian and amateur theologian and ice cream enthusiast.
All relevant for space hippies.
There we go.
Okay. So, in this episode, the Enterprise is pursuing a stolen spaceship carrying an ambassador's son, amongst others. Classic stuff, the type of situation we've all been in. They have to get back the ambassador's son, and preferably the others, preferably the spaceship. Needless to say, this group is not keen on being gotten back, and so they end up destroying the spaceship, but the Enterprise beams everybody aboard, and they're space hippies. They are part of this movement that seeks the planet Eden. Basically, they want to sort of go back to primitive. I'm going to just imagine every time throughout the episode that we use the word primitive, that we're putting scare quotes around it, even if we forget to. They want to go back to primitive life and sort of escape the technology of the Star Trek era and things like this. Most of them seem to be true believers in this cause. But their leader, Dr. Severin, has an ulterior motive. He has been infected with a disease that was basically created by the artificial environments and the technology that allows life to function in this era. And his goal basically is to sort of cleanse his body of this by escaping the technological world. They determine that he is insane, that his followers don't necessarily know or appreciate that. And the space hippies generally sort of plot to hijack the Enterprise, go to the planet Eden, and then just live their happy lives singing and eating fruit. While this is going on, you have a number of different responses from the Enterprise personnel. Kirk tries to exert his authority, and Severin is basically like, we recognize no authority save that within ourselves. So Kirk doesn't know how to respond to this. Scotty is just disgusted with the whole thing, which is one of the funniest elements of the episode. Most of the Enterprise crew are like, yeah, they're singing funny songs and wearing weird clothes. I'm fine with this. But Spock seems to genuinely sort of connect with this group. He understands the philosophy. He wants to use the Enterprise's computers to find Eden for them, etc., etc. And then you've got Chekhov, who was at the Academy and had some kind of romantic relationship that ended badly. Details are fuzzy, with Irina Galilean, who's now one of the space hippies. So he is divided between being, Chekhov, being a member of the Enterprise crew, member of Starfleet, versus his desire to sort of rekindle his connection with this old girlfriend. So that sort of leads everything. That's sort of the conflicting forces going on throughout the bulk of the episode. Finally, the space hippies do hijack the Enterprise. They go to the planet Eden, which Spock and Chekhov have found. They take a shuttlecraft down, only to find that all of the plants are full of acid and all of the fruit is poisonous, thereby learning the horrible lesson that Eden will kill you painfully.
Yeah.
So that's the upshot of the episode. So there's a lot of stuff that I think is worth talking about here. So where would you like to start?
You come up with a place to start. I've got a lot of thoughts about it, but I don't know exactly where to start here.
Okay.
I guess we could talk about whether or not there's a legitimate basis for rebelling against authority, such as the crew did, our crew of space hippies.
Okay.
We obviously see a few different sides of these space hippies represented. On one hand, you feel for them because their mission is a peaceful mission. It's just to find a place to live, and in that respect, even though they are somewhat cringy, they are generally portrayed to be harmless and generally good souls. Yeah. You can kind of see that if we can relate it directly to the hippie movement, we see that there was historically a righteous rebellion against such things like the Vietnam War, and that was a clear example of a righteous rebellion against a generally recognized authority, because later on we found out things about events such as like the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where we found out that involvement in Vietnam was basically manufactured by certain people in the government, and that the people against the war were right all along.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think there is an interesting there's a split right within this group. And you kind of got Severin on one side and all of the other space hippies on the other. I mean, with maybe Tunga Ran somewhere in the middle. That's the ambassador's son. So, and I say that because generally you're right. The space hippies, Adam, the guy who sings continually, the other, Irina, and the other sort of unnamed people in the group, they all seem just very chill. They're, hanging out, having a sing-along. They're not really doing anything particularly aggressive or anything like this. Severin, even from the beginning, aggression seems to be sort of his modus operandi. I mean, when he first confronts Kurt after being beamed aboard, he's very, very angry in a way that the other members of the group aren't. And then later, like when they've taken over the ship and they've gotten to Eden, Severin sets up the way they plan to neutralize the Enterprise crew, right, is by setting up this high frequency sound machine that's basically going to knock everybody out. Severin actually plans to kill them. Irina is ethically conflicted about that, but Severin assures her that it's not going to do permanent harm. And the reason I put Tungarand kind of in the middle here is because he's like, that will kill them. But he doesn't attempt to stop Severin from doing that.
Yeah.
So there's that interesting gap in, to bring it back to that question of rebelling against authority, right? For Severin, that means I will achieve my goal even if I have to kill 430 some people. For the rest of the space hippies, that seems to be more nonviolent civil disobedience and the sort of performance art of, what's the guy's name? Abby Kaufman, I think? That doesn't sound completely right, but...
Andy Kaufman?
No, Andy Kaufman, a different guy.
Okay. Well,
I'm going to look this up, and I will come back to it, but there was an attempt as a sort of performance art piece to bring a bunch of anti-war protesters together and to use the force of their will to levitate the Pentagon. And it was organized by Abby Hoffman. Yeah. Abby Hoffman is the guy. He was nonviolent in his methods. And so there does seem to be this sort of split between this sort of Abby Hoffman peacenik style of the main group and his more sort of militant.
As the episode progressed, I got the impression that Severin was more of like a Charlie Manson figure.
Yeah,
he's the guy that plays on the essential goodness of these hippies in order to achieve his own goals, because they are like true believers in this cause to find this natural world to live in, but he just wants to go there because he believes that the disease that's in him will finally disappear for some reason. I don't know why he believes that the disease will disappear, but he does, and that's his true motivation. He doesn't seem to care too much about living there. He just wants to get away from the world that exists.
Yeah,
and
I think
I think that is their main problem. They're driven by an acute desire to escape the world that they live in because they find it repulsive, but the world that they desire is far more dangerous and hostile than the world that they are trying to abandon. I think there's a lot of naivety and a lot of hubris in their actions. Like one of Adam's songs really lays that bare for me when he talks about eating the fruit off the tree and throwing away the rind. He comes off as arrogant and entitled and wasteful. Like he believes that he is entitled to the fruit of this planet and he's going to be the leader of the planet. Like they themselves are like becoming a sort of authority figure. Like through their like stubborn insistence of doing whatever they want, they become their own authority figure.
Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff there that's really interesting, and I think is really good. I want to come back to the Charles Manson comparison for just a second, because I think that's really a spot-on comparison. And it links directly to this, to the alienation that this group of people feels. Because that was one of the things about the Manson family, right? Was Manson was able to sort of gather them all together because they felt like they had no place in society, that they didn't belong. And, as with any cult, the key task of the leader in building that cult mentality is to say, you belong here doing what I tell you. Severin does the same thing. And so I think that's a really apt comparison. But I think that idea of alienation within their own society is super, super important here. This episode has what for me is one of my favorite lines in all of Star Trek, where Spock says they regard themselves as aliens in their own worlds, a condition with which I am somewhat familiar.
Yeah.
Because I think that's a thing that really, in some ways, that's a very apt sort of understanding of the hippie movement. People whose values and worldviews did not align with mainstream American values and worldviews. This is why we call it the counterculture, right? And of course, Spock experiences that because he's half human and half Vulcan, raised on Vulcan, but never truly Vulcan. But at the same time, I can never hear that line without thinking this is a line being delivered again by a Jewish actor. Leonard Nimoy is a Jewish actor. And one of the sort of paradoxes that we as Jews have always faced is never being properly accepted as part of our own cultures. American Jews are fully Americanized for most of us, but there's still something that sort of sets us apart, some risk of distrust. And so I think that's such a layered line. And I know we've gotten a little bit away from that question of authority and stuff like this, but I think it's relevant because authority depends upon people to accept the legitimacy of that authority, right? And if you don't feel that your values, your worldview, your objectives are reflected by the way a particular authority behaves, you may not feel bound to obey that authority. I mean, we can see that to a certain extent, I think, right now with what just happened in Russia. This is going to be a very timely discussion that years from now people are not going to necessarily get. But the Wagner Group literally just said, this is bullshit. The way that this war is being run is bad. We're going to turn around and head back to Russia, and we're going to take out some top people in the military establishment in order to make sure that the war is run the way we think it should be run. There was a deal made between the Wagner Group and Putin, but that sort of notion of we don't recognize your ethical authority to do the things that you're doing, and therefore we are going to turn the guns on you. It raises a lot of ethical questions.
Yeah, especially to the extent of that, Wagner Group isn't quite a very ethical organization to begin with.
Yeah.
To see what they find distasteful, it's like, I'm not sure how much I want to know about that.
Yeah.
But I was also thinking of the way that the American reactionary movement right now, the MAGA movement, they all view themselves as independent thinkers.
Yep.
And free thinkers and anti-authority, but they all have their cult leader and their talking points. And we'll get back to this later, but there's a lot. I think there's a lot to be mined from this episode that is very relevant to today's politics.
Yeah, definitely. So, we've sort of talked a little bit about the sort of generally positive attitude of most of the space hippies, Dr. Severin accepted, of course. What do you think of the quest for Eden?
Well, I'm very sympathetic to their desire to find this quest for Eden. How Spock described every planet as manicured and everything is clean and all the atmospheres are maintained, and they themselves spend all of their time in a spaceship. Like I would probably go insane if I was stuck in a spaceship, if I couldn't go outside ever again. So I'm pretty, I find myself sympathetic to this desire to just be out in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And but then, I also find a lot of hubris and a lot of naivety within these people, because they spent their entire life in a world that is designed for human comfort, or a sentient being comfort. I don't want to say human. But all of these people in this group appear to be well off, or from well off backgrounds. We have doctors, we have former Federation. What was she? Was she a cadet? Academy? Yeah. And there were the singer. He was like a nuclear physicist or something.
I don't remember what he was exactly.
He was some kind of. I remember they described him as some kind of scientist. And Dr. Severin was a scientist. The other guy was the son of royalty. They didn't really describe what the other two women, their backgrounds were, but it was kind of implied that they all were of sort of upper class backgrounds, and thus they didn't really,
upper middle class. Yeah,
they didn't really seem to really grasp what they were getting themselves into, because, as we all know, nature is the cosmic meat grinder and does not care whether you live or die. It just does what it does, and it will continue to keep doing that for forever. And a lot of ways, civilization is humanity's endless battle against the forces of nature. We try to, we build shelter to, prevent dying of exposure. We farm to keep people from starving. We do all of these things to stop the natural process from happening to us specifically. And it's a social process, and a lot of this behavior is extremely antisocial.
Definitely.
If you want to talk about the primitive, excuse me, God, I can't speak today. But the primitivism movement, we have people like Ted Kaczynski, who ended up sending bombs to people because he hated technology, and the whole movement is just about returning to before agriculture, before domesticated animals, and to do something like that, to actually accomplish something like that, will require death on a scale never before heard of. So they don't. In a certain level, you can be sympathetic to wanting to return to a more primitive life, but then when you realize what that would actually entail, you realize that it's a little too late for that sort of thing. We've moved past it a long time ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, in terms of the back to nature style of primitivism, I think there's an issue with trying to pretend you can just opt out of the social contract. I mean, people like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau obviously came up with the idea of the social contract. And one of the things that's interesting about Locke is like, it's a contract that we all agree to abide by virtue of the fact that we exist within a society. We don't get the choice to not do it. And I think that's one of the things that like the Back to Nature movement tried to sort of rebel against and say, look, we can leave the social contract. The problem, of course, with that is that society is pretty pervasive. Like, sure, you can build like a farming commune or something like that, but even there, you're part of a social contract. So, I mean, there's definitely that element of like, if you actually wanted to escape the social contract, you have to eliminate the social part of it. And in order to do that, very, very difficult to do that on an individual level. Theoretically, yes, you could go out and like live in the woods in a cave or something like that, but that's not a feasible large-scale movement, obviously.
Right.
But the other thing with primitivism is it tends to be very wrapped up in racism, right? Whether that's sort of like the primitivism, the art movement of, say, the early 1900s through mid 1900s. So we're like, oh, let's take a bunch of traditional African styles and we'll use those in our art and stuff like this, and this sort of commodification of traditional African or Asian or Polynesian or whatever it was culture, or in the more American context, the idea of the noble savage, right, with the romanticization of indigenous Americans as these sort of in tune with nature, peaceful, living in harmony with the land, etc., etc. And there's elements of truth to those things. Like I don't want to pretend that none of those are real virtues that many indigenous communities have.
Absolutely, nothing is ever that clean.
Yeah. And I think it's not specifically racism in the sense that the primitives that Dr. Severin thinks can cleanse him are not racially coded in a specific way. But I think it's hard to imagine the primitives as not somehow being an ethnic other. Would you agree with that, or no?
Yeah, I would probably say that it's probably accurate. They did purposely kind of leave it very, very like vague as to what he was actually talking about.
Yeah.
But to think about it in the terms of the day and age, like it makes sense to think about that in the terms of like a noble savage framing.
Yeah. And we do actually have previous episodes that play into that trope. We've got the sort of Polynesian-inspired people in... I can't remember the name of the episode, but the episode where they worship Val. These are clearly meant to be like native Hawaiians, pre-colonial contact. In This Side of Paradise, I think is the right episode title, where Kirk lives with people who've been like literally been apparently transported from 3 or 4 Native American nations and put on this other planet. And he's happy in this sort of idyllic pastoral paradise. So there's clearly an awareness of the noble savage trope in Star Trek. But I think this also sort of begs the opposite question, or raises the opposite question rather, which is, what about technology?
In what sense? What is it? Is it? I would say, there's a lot of. All right, I will bring up this. I'll take a little left turn with this question. And bring up this. I saw this discourse on Twitter, and it made my brain hurt. There is. I don't know how serious it is, but I saw a discourse around alleviating the suffering of wild animals, and it intrigued me because how do you do that? So one of the comments,
red flags are already going up.
What's that?
Red flags are already going up for me.
Right. So the main proposal was that you destroy all of the predators and then have a euthanasia program to control all of the remaining animals. And I'm like, well, we destroyed the old, we got rid of all the old horrors and made all new ones, haven't we? So I think we tend to think our ethical values can be applied to nature, and they really can't. And a lot of our technological control over nature has resulted in a lot of terrible consequences for nature and for people. And while I'm never going to be one to say that technology is bad, because technology is what advances society. It helps increase leisure time, quality of life, medicine, that sort of thing. We need to learn a lot of lessons from what we have done to the environment to try to minimize our manipulation of the chaos of nature, because there's no way we're going to be able to establish total dominion over the natural world. And any attempt to, I believe, will result in inevitable catastrophe.
Well, I mean, I think you look no further than global climate change today. I mean,
in a lot of ways, I think the ideal progression of technology is to engineer it in a way that it disappears. We grow like trees that also are lampposts. We have a plant that has Wi-Fi. We have a giant tree that's also where people live. Technology should advance to the point where it just supports people. And I guess I'm not sure how I'm trying to describe this, but technology should just advance to the point where it kind of just disappears and it becomes secondary, a secondary tool of human beings.
Okay, I can get on board with that.
I don't know. It's just a fun theory.
Yeah. Well, so in some ways that seems almost like the opposite direction of the universe Star Trek envisions, right? Because as both the space hippies and Spock acknowledge, this is a world in which the air that they breathe is recycled and filtered by machines. The temperature is controlled by machines. The lighting is controlled by machines. The Enterprise feeds its crew through food synthesizers. And I mean, in some ways, that's probably actually quite a good thing, right? If you're synthesizing food from, I don't know what they're synthesizing it from, but
well,
one of the
they address that, and a lot of the times they synthesize the food through waste products on the starships.
Yeah, so that comes up in other series. It doesn't, I think, come up in the original series,
No, I
but
don't
it's a reasonable supposition. Uh, I don't think anybody ever thinks about it, particularly in the original series. They just accept that the food synthesizers work. But I mean, like right now, one of the great horrors of the world we live in is industrial scale farming, right? Like, if I go to the store and I buy a package of chicken, I have to sort of repress the knowledge of how horrific the living conditions of those chickens are. If I go and buy a hamburger somewhere, I have to repress the knowledge of how brutally that cow was killed to be processed. And like, in that sense, something like food synthesizers may actually be a really beneficial advancement if we don't have to do that in order to feed people. But again, this is the Star Trek universe is a universe completely of technology. Like, apart from when they go out onto random planets and stuff, which they always have to check using their technology to make sure that it's a Class M planet, that it's got the right kind of atmosphere, that it's got the right kind of heat, that it's livable for human beings. Like, most of the people's lives in this seem to be lived in exclusively technological spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like what you're talking about is kind of the opposite of that, where rather than technology becoming the space in which we live, almost the spaces in which we live becoming a sort of integrated, becoming natural spaces in which we might live, becoming integrated with technology.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's very interesting. Do you think the space hippies would be more on board with that?
Yeah. Well, I'm very sympathetic to the space hippies for sure.
Yeah.
Like, I always think about, there's this moment from the extended version of Aliens where Ripley has just been rescued from the coma pod, and she's sitting next to a window when there's plants and it appears to be raining, and then it pans out and she's just sitting on the spaceship and it's just a screen that's just playing an image of a window with outside, and it's raining. So it kind of speaks to the need for people to, like, sort of, you know, even on some extent to just pretend that we are still part of, like, a natural planet. I don't know, you know, there's a lot of media and literature about space travel, but there hasn't really been any actual discourse or evidence or really experience on, like, what that does to, like, a human to be, like, is it even possible for a human being to be on another planet, like, to be in space? Like, how much of, like, the rhythms of our bodies and ourselves, like, rely on the rhythms of the Earth and the different magnetic fields and the different other fields on the planet. Like, we don't know, like, how synced up we are to just living on this area, that the idea of going to another planet where gravity is different, like, if you can even speak to somebody at all, your voice will be different because of the different air pressures. So there's a lot of different things to think about going to another planet that is ignored by people who view it as an adventure rather than, like, you know, a place to go and sit in a pod until you die.
Yeah.
Like, people who want to go to Mars, like, don't really understand that there's nothing on Mars. Like, people in the frontier of, like, the American frontier, they could go out into the forest, they could chop down trees, build a house, they could gather, they could plant food, they could kill a deer. Everything they need to survive is there. for them to take. But on some place like Mars, unless you brought it from somewhere else, there's nothing for people there. So it's it kind of is a non-starter unless there's some way to magical way to transform Mars into like an Earth-like habitat.
Yeah. That's actually really interesting that you brought up that sort of question of humans' biological rhythms or patterns or whatever it is being sort of synced up with the Earth, because actually the episode right before this, Requiem for Methuselah, had a character named Flint, who on Earth was immortal. He was born in ancient Mesopotamia, and he lived up through the Star Trek era, and he does all these amazing things. He's Leonardo da Vinci, he's Brahms, he's all these different people. And finally, he goes out into space, and he's just like, you know what? Fuck this planet. I'm going to go live on my own planet and just be a genius by myself. And at the end of the episode, McCoy's like, yeah, I did the medical testing, having left the unique combination of forces on the Earth, Flint is now going to age and die at a normal rate. So, I mean, Star Trek does sort of anticipate that in an interesting way. But the other thing I was thinking about as I was thinking back over this episode, in terms of like the role that technology plays in how we live our lives. I mean, you were saying that your back was hurting. One of the things that, one theory that some people have about why we have such pervasive back issues now is we walk on concrete rather than walking on grass, sand, mud, these kinds of things. And we sit a lot more because our lifestyles are technologically oriented. We do much less manual labor and particularly much less sort of outside moving around type labor than our hunter-gatherer ancestors would have done. And so these sort of technologies that have made our lives easier and more secure have also produced a lot of problems for us.
In a lot of ways, like the evolution of our minds is overtaking the evolution of our bodies.
Yeah, I think that's definitely.
Like a cell phone has become like a technological appendage to humanity. It's like an extra. It's an external part of your body that you can use to access this overmind of information that exists now. It's a pretty interesting way to look at it, like how technology is our high-tech prostheses to make up for the fact that our bodies haven't evolved fast enough.
Yeah. Well, and that's of course an interesting one, because there's always that sort of Luddite, oh, kids today don't have these essential skills from when I was a kid kind of thing. So, I mean, when you talk about technological prostheses, I think there's definitely a lot to that. But at the same time, I think we do want to avoid the whole, like, do kids today even know what a CD is kind of
right,
discourse.
Because like at every point, like we have, like, when we say that, like, oh, you don't have this skill, it's like, well, because they don't need that skill, they have this other skill that they need to survive in this technological environment.
Yeah.
So it's not that they lack skills; they just have different skills.
Yeah. And whenever anybody pulls out the whole "kids today don't know X" thing, I always just think back to Plato, because one of the things Plato said, or according to Plato, one of the things Socrates really hated was the idea of writing, because he thought that technology was going to destroy people just memorizing all the information.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I've seen that
at
one
least
recently.
at least 2,500 years ago, we have recorded instances of people saying the kids today don't know what they need to know. So,
Yeah, and it's another instance of, if we don't do things the way that I did it, then society will fall apart.
yeah.
And we see that it has not fallen apart quite yet.
Nope.
Not quite yet.
Not quite yet. Okay, so there is one more question I want us to touch on, and that's the hippie movement as a whole. It's very fun and easy today, I think, to sort of make fun of the hippies. Eric Cartman has taught us that, if nothing else.
Yeah, hippies all around me. Mommy, hippies. Hippies, they're everywhere. They want to save the earth, but all they do is smoke pot and smell bad. Help.
But overall assessment of the hippie movement: success, failure, positive,
I
negative.
think it was a massive success.
Yeah,
I think the movement was a massive success. It had a lot of great effects on the arts. A lot of the psychedelic rock and pop blossomed, and the attitudes blossomed into things like punk rock, heavy metal.
Oh.
A lot of the style was integrated into mainstream America by the 70s, like the big bell bottoms, long hair. It was a big influence in relaxing gender norms, freedom of gender expression, beginning of the sexual revolution, LGBT rights. So while I think a lot of the backlash against the hippie movement is to downplay the very real successes that they did achieve, and unfortunately they all burned out on some bad drugs, and we don't have most of them around anymore. But I think that their influence and legacy has been undeniably positive on the culture of the West.
I actually tend to agree. I'd also add that they brought anti-war discourse. They brought pro-civil rights and pro-equality discourse, in addition to feminism, LGBT rights, etc., etc. They brought those things into mainstream American discourse in a way that you look at a movement like the Beatniks, who had similar values in many ways. They just weren't ever able to achieve mainstream success. So I think you're absolutely right there. Like they did a lot of things. They had a utopian vision that was very beneficial to the U.S., particularly, I'd say, as we got into the Nixon era. Slightly late hippie movement. But the one caveat I would put on this is that the hippies' emphasis on individualism, I think, gets distorted when you get to the late 70s and the 80s and you start to get into the neoliberal era, because the hippies believed in individual freedom, individual expression, and things like this, coupled with a social responsibility. We have to stop the war. We have to stop segregation. We have to stop the oppression of women, etc., etc. But you take that sort of individual freedom and you put that in the Reagan era, what you get is individual freedom coupled with individual power, and I can do whatever is good for me, and I don't need to sort of think about anybody else. And whether it's fair to blame the hippies for that, it is worth, I think, keeping in mind that they precipitate that shift from 1950s conformity and workers' union oriented culture and things like this toward that 1980s brutal individualism.
Yeah, and I think there's a dark side to every into every movement. But also, when those ideas become mainstream, there's people who hear them that don't quite understand them, and you view it as an excuse for personal misbehavior.
Yeah.
So I think that I mean, like, it's true that the hippies, you know, like, they put that idea out there, but I don't know if it's fair to blame them for what people did with, like, an idea of, like, you know, just like a personal autonomy. I don't know if people, they could be blamed for what people have done with that necessarily, unless, like, some of them, you know, have been bought in and sold out or whatever, and we're the same people. But one thing I do want to touch on is a lot of the counterculture movements during the 60s and 70s were about screwing up people's view of the world, and, like, challenging how they behave, like what they would obey, things like that. Like, there was the movement of Discordianism that was led by people like Kerry Thornley and Greg Hill. They promoted a lot of events that would mess with people's minds. They would go into department stores and put absurd rules and sign them to management and see what people would actually do. And a lot of the classic conspiracy theories were invented by these people in the 60s and 70s. And I think while they were trying to make a point about what people can be led to do, I feel like they didn't anticipate the damage that would cause, because most people are not equipped to handle that sort of thing. And now we have movements like the QAnon movement, who are just basically denying all evidence except for what they believe. Like the whole push of the counterculture of reality is what you can get away with, and nothing is true, everything is permitted, has really backfired in terms of the actual discourse we are faced with today, where everything is where everything is true and nothing is permitted.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important element of this. Is like, you challenge people's perceptions, and you can never really tell what perceptions are going to come out the other side. Yeah.
And I also was struck by particularly how relevant Dr. Severin's refusal of medical treatment was. He didn't want to. It reminded me of the anti-vax movement now, because Dr. Severin had a very clearly highly infectious and disease that they couldn't even treat all the way with their advanced technology, and yet he refused to do anything about it because of his personal liberty. So that is a clear example of how that sort of thing breeds antisocial behavior.
I think that's definitely true. I mean, and there's a lot of evidence that once you get someone to buy into a particular conspiracy theory, it's much easier to get them to buy into other conspiracy theories as well. This is part of the reason why I blame Ancient Aliens. Fuck you, History Channel. You've done this to us.
Can we go back? Yeah. Can we go back further and blame Eric von Daniken? I think it's his fault.
We can, yeah. I'm perfectly willing to do that. But yeah, I think Ancient Aliens theory and this kind of stuff was really one of the first sort of popularized conspiracy theories that had sort of extensive stuff going on with it, right? Because, like, sure, a lot of people believe there was multiple shooters with the JFK assassination or something like that, but you're not having
also don't discount the UFO.
Yeah. But I feel like there's a turn at some point from like this is science fiction that we're interested in to this is conspiracy theory. And
Yeah, it
this
happened.
pre-ancient aliens UFO movement is an interesting gray area there.
Yeah, but yeah, it seemed to happen in like in the days post 9/11 that all of this,
Yes.
all of this shift seemed to happen.
Yeah, and that's definitely legit. The 9/11 truther movement was probably a big driving force in
And then you had the
popular explosion of
Tea
conspiracy
Party
theories.
with
Yep.
with the Obama birth
The
certificate.
birthers. Yep.
And everything has been pretty much a straight line since then.
Yeah.
Of one movement to another.
Gross. This world that we live in.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Well, okay, so for all the stuff that's bad about the world that we live in, again, Star Trek did envision a better world. And I think it's an interesting episode, The Way to Eden, because a contemporary movement of the hippies of 1969 comes along and challenges the ethos of the Star Trek universe. This supposedly better, more advanced, more equitable universe still has the same existential quandaries that we have and that they had in 69.
Yeah, that's true. And just like Spock, I was sympathetic to their quest, and at the end, I was very happy to see that that Spock was still encouraging them to look for that planet.
Yeah.
So it may be futile, maybe a futile quest, but it's well within their rights to go ahead and try to find it. It's according to their philosophy. If they want to go find this planet, I see more power to them. They can go.
I think that's
somewhere else.
I'm sure Scotty would agree with that assessment.
Yeah, me and Scotty are aligned on that issue.
All right.
But
well, what were you going to say?
Nothing. I already said.
Okay. Well, again, Matt, as always, thanks for being here. This was a very, very engaging conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yep.
Enjoy the episode. Enjoy the conversation. Until next time.